Good afternoon and welcome back to the final keynote dialogue session of the first day of 2022 DCON Festival. This dialogue session is going to focus on design thinking for complex systemic challenges, and in a moment I'll introduce you to Richard Perez and his guest, who's going to, obviously Richard will be moderating the conversation. In an hour then we'll go to the reflections and recap of day one. And we've been asking you all day, we will be asking you again tomorrow and on Wednesday, what is it that we need to celebrate around design thinking? What is it that we need to interrogate around design thinking? And what do we need to anticipate? And hopefully in that half an hour, you'll be joining us on site. You'll be online, but on site here with your reflections. We want to use that half an hour to its maximum to get some reflections. It certainly helps with us who are conceiving and obviously executing the Con Festival, but we really want to hear what you are thinking. So please do spend some of the last hour just thinking on what your reflections are going to be. Richard Perez needs no introduction. He's been on stage twice already today, and he's here now to moderate the final one. Richard.
Africa, thank you very much. And yeah, really wonderful to be here towards the end of the day, and specifically on a topic which is very close to my heart, and especially in sort of the latter years of when I was, I guess, more in the design industry or design space before I joined the D School. And that's really the role that design plays in complex systems. I think my experience in public sector work was that if you go in there with certain language, certain terms, people run 100 miles. And my real takeaway and reflection from those years was the importance of deconstructing this thing called design thinking and reconstructing it in a way which people understand, and people feel comfortable with, and people feel safe with. So it's with great pleasure to invite two very accomplished speakers onto the stage. We have one in person, Professor Jeanne Liedtka, and we have Scott Weiss dialing in from the east coast of the States, I believe. Welcome. Unfortunately, we did have our third speaker, Agnes Kwek, who is going to join us from Singapore, but unfortunately she had a family bereavement, so she wasn't able to join us on the stage, but it does give us more time to listen to both Jeanne and Scott, which will be wonderful. So let me first introduce Jeanne. Jeanne is the UTC Professor of Business at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business, where she has taught design thinking to thousands of people, both students and executives, and to hundreds and thousands on her very popular online design thinking course on the Coursera platform. Beginning her career as a strategy consultant for the Boston Consulting Group, Jeanne has also served as Chief Learning Officer at United Technologies and as a Senior Associate Dean of Darden's MBA program. She has written a number of books and many articles on the subject of strategy, innovation, and design thinking in both the private and service sector. So I think give a great round of applause to Jeanne.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Before Jeanne starts, I'm also going to introduce Scott. Scott is the co-founder and chief creative officer of Catalyst, a global design firm focused on helping the public sector solve systemic challenges related to innovation and modernization. Catalyst was born out of his experience as a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow, where he helped federal leaders and communities across government strengthening their human-centered design, customer experience, and innovation capabilities and practices. Scott began his professional design journey at the award-winning agency IDEO, where he worked as an organizational and systems strategist for about 6.5 years. In his spare time, Scott also is a guest lecturer at the New York University, Parsons, Duke University, and the University of Illinois on topics such as design thinking for social impact, design research, and storytelling. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion around how design has been reconstructed in a way that people can start to understand and embrace it, and specifically dealing with complex organizations and complex systems. So, Jeanne, we're going to start with you. and your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Well, it's wonderful to be here. It sounds weird hearing yourself in kind of an echo like this, yeah. But I'm delighted to talk about, well, I thought we were going to lead off with why I love design thinking. Remember that, right?
Let's start there.
Fortunately, why I love design thinking intersects very well with this idea of complex systems, and in particular, this challenge that we've mentioned a lot today, which is the one of how do we build adaptable, resilient systems amid the complexity of the world we live in now. I guess to cut to the heart of what I see when I look at the academic research on complexity, it's that operating in complex systems as opposed to stable, predictable systems has two very dramatic characteristics that I think are worth calling out because I think they're ones that are particularly well suited to what we bring in the design thinking world. The first is decentralization. Certainly most large organizations, especially coming from my world of the business school, are essentially hierarchies. They're top-down systems of control. And the first thing we notice about complex systems is that top-down control does not work. The environment is changing too quickly around us for top-down rules. By the time they've reached the actual local level, chances are they're already obsolete. So this whole notion of how do we build a group of people who are capable of acting in that kind of decentralized fashion without giving them rules to operate by. The second quality is the quality of emergence. That in these complex systems, our traditional approaches to decision making, I think a lot of this kind of echoes some of what GK was talking about for those of us who were in his breakout. You can't see the solution as you begin the conversation, right? The conversations, the solutions that work are emergent. They emerge out of the real-time conversation that a diverse group of stakeholders is involved in. And when they work because a group of people who see every different aspect of the system are able to come together and align about what's important and see together what no one of them was ever capable of seeing alone. So just going in through this window of how do we build people who are able to see and act on opportunity and transform their world working with other people who likely think very differently than they do, really, for me, leads us almost straight to design thinking. And again, listening to GK, I think there are certainly always things that we can criticize. Coming from the business world and the methodologies we have, for me, design thinking is such a movement towards goodness. It brings this whole rich array of very different ways of looking at the world and acting, and it brings with it a toolkit. So I think the possibilities are just extraordinary. So let me just first start with this idea of deconstructing. Hoda said today that one of the things we really needed to be able to do for the rest of the world was to better articulate the value that design brings. Okay. Those of us trained as an accountant, which is a part of my past that I rarely share publicly in a room full of designers, putting a measure on what design thinking brings is very challenging. I think it's in part because we toss around this term design thinking, which is really an extraordinarily complex and diverse set of activities and tools. Right? And in order to really understand how value is created, I think you actually do need to decompose design thinking and to go ahead and look at the individual pieces. So let me go to my first slide. Here we go. Now, this is like a death slide, isn't it? Like, someone should be shot who's showing this slide at 3:15 at the end of a long day, right? But in part, the message of this slide is how extraordinarily complex it is to trace the elements of design thinking back through a set. Oh, I'm slipping already. I've never had the microphone taped to my face before.
Is that?
Okay, thank you. To trace these practices that we talk about in design thinking through to a set of behaviors and mindsets they encourage. And only when you've done that can you pull them to the kind of outcomes we're talking about in organizations, whether that's being more efficient, increasing our sales, more effectively serving our customers, whatever it is. So here, just to give you a flavor for what this might look like, I've looked at 5 very simple elements of design thinking practice that we would all recognize and talk about, right? Things like deep user understanding, diverse teams coming together, dialogue-based conversations, right? The amount of structure that design thinking brings, and in fact, the very linearity of that structure, which designers so often object to, is, in my view, what makes it so powerful for the rest of us in this world. Right? If we unpack each of those, we can see here, and again, in another moment, at another time, I'm happy to share lots of information. There's a very boring, like 50-page paper behind this that says, we pull apart the pieces of design thinking and we look at how they foster 3 things that we talk about a great deal in the business strategy world: creating capabilities to sense opportunity, creating abilities to seize opportunity, and then creating abilities to transform larger group settings, whether they're organizations or networks, because of that. And I think when you unpack the practices of design thinking into the pieces, it becomes clear pretty quickly that it's actually working to overcome a set of social and cognitive biases that we've known about for a very long time in the social sector, but have rarely taken the trouble to piece out how design thinking operates. And only when you understand how it transforms the teams and the organizations who use it, how it brings what we've called a social technology, a different way of having a conversation. Lots of complex pieces to that, but when you bring them all together, the things we care about at the end, like sales and costs and things like that, they only work because of the intermediate effects of increasing organizations' capabilities to see, to seize, and to transform. For me, there's one more element in which design thinking goes even deeper, though, and that's really at the level of the individual. So in some ways, it seems kind of counterintuitive to say we're here to talk about complex systems, but I really want to talk about how design thinking transforms those of us who use it. And the way at a very personal individual level, we are not the same when we've really embraced design thinking done deeply and well, right? One day hackathons may not get us there, but I think a deep commitment to design thinking will. So at the surface, design looks like a pretty obvious set of activities, right? We gather data, we look for insights, we do a whole set of things, we test, we prototype, we experiment. But in our research over the past probably 10 years, following non-designers as they move through the design thinking process and really trying to understand through things like journals what they're actually thinking and experience, what's happening is they are having a profound set of personal experiences, right? So those activities that look like they're the heart of design thinking are merely the triggers, so that the designers themselves, the innovators who are using it, are fundamentally becoming different people because they use it. Right? So the experience of immersion is probably the most obvious, right? Ethnographic data gathering, immersing ourselves in the lives of other people, of the people we're designing for, fundamentally transformed us. And those of us who teach know what happens the first time we set our students out to interview someone, right? And they come back fundamentally changed about that kind of human connection. A human connection that builds things like emotional attachment and engagement. In the world of business, we've largely ignored emotions for a very long time, but emotions are the key to change. We know that. Desires drive change, not business goals. And so this immersion step really begins to get at who we are, how we relate to other people, in a way that sets the stage for the rest of the process. So then we look for insights, right? If we're successful, and that's certainly a challenging part, right? We come away from insights piece inspired and confident that we can do that kind of work. Right? As we, as a team or a group, align with a common focus on those we're designing for, right? Alignment happens. And we begin to come into alignment with a group of people so that we come to understand together what the shape of the problem is, and in particular, what the criteria are that defines a good solution. And we're only able to do that because of the experience of immersion and the experience of sense-making, right? So cumulatively, what happens at that point, we get to emergence, and we're equipped to work together with a group of people who think differently than we are, and using the social technology of design thinking to listen to them in different ways, right? And then prototyping helps us make things real, and experimentation, perhaps the trickiest of all, even though we talk about learning in action as though it's easy, is what really allows us to learn from our experiences as we tinker and iterate and work all of that. So for me, this personal transformation, this ability of design to change us so that we can change the world for other people, is what allows us to operate in a decentralized environment where emergent solutions are the best. And I'll just end with what kind of looks simple in the end, right? At the end of this research we've been doing, we've been trying to say, well, if we step away from the language of design thinking and design thinking tools, what really are the core competencies that we're trying to build? And it turns out you don't even need the word design anywhere in there. What we're building with design thinking is a set of capabilities for resilience, for change readiness, for working across difference, kind of very fundamental set of skills. And then magically, I think in some ways, those changes in who we are and what we're capable of are the only foundation that I can think of to assure any kind of success in a complex system. So with that, I will stop talking and thank you for tolerating me.
Thank you, Jeanne, and we'll certainly circle back on, I think, a couple of those points, because you've mentioned a number of key concepts, which I'd love to unpack a little bit more, and I'm sure the audience would love to hear a little bit more on that. But let's move over to Scott. Scott, I believe you're going to share the slides from your side.
Yeah, I will. Before I do that, I want to just thank all of you for inviting me here today. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this panel and a part of this conversation. And I really wish I could be there in person. So I'm sorry I can't. If I do well, hopefully I get invited back next year so I can share the stage with you wonderful folks. And Jeanne, you are so inspiring. I want to take all of your classes. So would love to figure out a way to continue the conversation with you. For over the long term, and rather than for my intro, rather than talking about some of these concepts, I want to really personalize my story for you all and how I came to really come across some of these big questions around the application of design for solving systemic challenges in society. And I'll start with my time at IDEO, because what's interesting, Jeanne, you talked a lot about how, behaviors can really inspire transformation, infusing some of those behaviors. And I noticed that a bit at my time at IDEO, but it really wasn't until my last year when I was introduced to this notion of systems design and using design thinking as a way to bring a sort of cross-section of stakeholders together to discuss and solve some really complex challenges. And I'm just gonna share my screen here just to make sure. Can everyone see that? Richard and Jeanne, yep. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. So this is kind of the question that's been guiding my career and my professional journey and how I sort of show up for the work that I have the privilege of getting to do. In my last year at IDEO, as I mentioned, the sort of systems thinking came up because I was brought in to support a project that was all around reimagining aging and dying in American society. And for me, it was really mind-blowing was this recognition that you can't talk about aging and dying in American society without addressing all of the interconnected systems and communities that play a role in how we experience that journey. You can't talk about aging and dying without talking about the healthcare system, the financial services system, the nonprofit sector. And this was an opportunity for IDEO as an organization to really put a stake in the ground and say, you know, we can't solve this in a vacuum, right? We have to really expand our thinking and expand the collective that we bring in to strategize really, you know, actionable outcomes for, because everyone is aging and dying, and this is a really an integral or a great inflection point for IDEO to reimagine systems design, and from that moment on, that's really the type of work I wanted to do. My last project at IDEO was all around reimagining modern Judaism and looking at the intersection of design and religion. And that was equally as fascinating because that was a moment to think about, hey, are these philosophies even compatible? And if so, how can we come together to really think about what does modern spirituality look like, and using design as the engine to rethink some of our relationship with religion. And then I want to go here because you know, from all of these inputs against challenges, like the aging project I worked on, like the religion challenge I worked on, and then another project I worked on with the New York City Mayor's office that was figuring out a strategy to bring the thriving tech community of New York City with underserved communities, and using the sort of the might of the tech industry to deliver meaningful solutions for some of these communities. And the first conversation I had with the mayor's office was, well, how are you currently creating a space to deliver some of these solutions? And Jeanne, you mentioned this in your talk. They said historically they'd done hackathons. And I said, what do those look like? How are you structuring these hackathons? And they said, oh, we just put a bunch of developers and technologists in a room, and you know, we give them a brief, and then they try to solve that brief. And my question to them was, are you bringing these communities into the conversation and discussing with them what their unmet needs are, what their pain points are, and what would sort of improve their day-to-day lives? And they said, that's a great idea. We should do that. So that was a really interesting pivot, certainly in the sort of local government work I got to do, where there was this acknowledgement that in order to create meaningful change in communities across New York City, there had to be some sort of force that brought them together to co-create solutions. And that's, you know, really where I saw the power of systems thinking take shape. From there, I continue to get really exciting about government's role in solving some of these systemic social challenges. And you know, I want to start here because recently, the data's right there. In last December, the Biden administration signed an executive order essentially mandating all of federal government to strengthen its service design and delivery capabilities, which, you know, at first glance doesn't seem that impressive. And I'm sure a lot of you are like, what does it actually mean? But it is quite a revolutionary act. And I got to work on the sort of the co-creation of this mandate to, you know, help federal government think about the infrastructure that they would need to build and the behaviors they would need to bring to bear with across government to actually meet citizens where they are and design solutions for their unmet needs. So this is a really great great moment in American history, looking at American government. And I encourage you to think about how design and customer experience shows up, you know, in your respective governments. But this was really exciting moment for me and us to think about the relationship between the bureaucracy of government and how to bring some of these design behaviors to improve the citizen experience in America. This is the program that actually brought me in to get the opportunity to work on that project. So in 2012, there was a really catastrophic incident where I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Affordable Care Act, but this is a really big moment in American history where the Obama administration passed a law that essentially enabled American citizens to register for more affordable healthcare plans, which was amazing. But they realized that they didn't necessarily have the technology to ensure that citizens who wanted to sign up for some of these healthcare plans were able to do so efficiently and effectively. So they stood up a platform called healthcare.gov, and it crashed immediately, which is this embarrassing failure for government insofar it had to reckon with the fact that it wasn't modern or innovative. So what it did just in this instance is it brought in private industry subject matter experts to work with government leaders to just bring the system back online. And they brought in design thinking. They triaged the system and were able to bring it back online. And the insight from that experience is that we need to scale this. We need to be working with private sector more intentionally and collaboratively to better meet the needs of citizens. So this is the program I came in to support and feel really grateful that I was able to bring some of these behaviors into the projects I got to work on. There's an organization within federal government now that's sort of a byproduct of what I got to work on, essentially a design and innovation studio that is resourced to support a cross-section of design challenges. So when we think about HCD practices at scale, this is one example of many now that's bringing design thinking and design practices into government. And this was actually the first project I got to work on where, because coming in to federal government, I was a bit, I wouldn't say skeptical, but curious how some of these practices were showing up. Were they just conversational, or were they actually being baked into structures and processes? And this is an example I like to share because design is now very much a part of the Department of Veterans Affairs. And that is a result of a scandal that took place, a crisis, in fact, that took place in 2015, where there was a VA medical center that had been reporting incorrect data to Congress about the wait times that veterans were experiencing for their appointments, or in some instances they were dying because their appointment times were months long. Their wait times were months long, and so this led to congressional hearings and this reckoning for government leaders once again to come together to reconcile the fact that they were not just not meeting the needs of veterans, but also they didn't have the infrastructure in place to understand what those needs were from a data standpoint, qualitatively and quantitatively. So they brought in a new secretary who was the former CEO of Procter & Gamble. And the first thing he and his team did was they stood up this office called the Veterans Experience Office that serves as almost an insights engine for this 400,000 employee organization serving 15 million veterans and their families. It's the world's largest integrated healthcare company. And the first act that they did is they hired a chief design officer. And that chief design officer asked all the right questions. I said, what is the journey that the veteran goes on after they sort of separate from military service? And they essentially mapped out this sort of end-to-end journey from separation to death, and as a way for the enterprise to better understand how the veteran navigates their systems, and really identify those moments that matter where the VA has been failing. So at the very least, this serves as an artifact to stimulate conversations about the value of design in an incredibly complex organization. So I wanted to share those few case studies with you all, because I think those really reflect the movement that's happening right now that we're seeing in design, particularly in the public sector, and its role in bringing these disparate communities together to co-create solutions that are actually meeting the needs of citizens, and actually bringing those citizens in to conversations about what would improve their lives. So I want to stop there, and thanks for letting me share those stories with you all.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Scott. So one of the themes that's emerged a little bit for me is this concept of moving away from designing for to designing with. Scott, you touched on it a little bit in your work. And Jeanne, you mentioned the concept of a sort of societal technology, design thinking, almost a new language which helps people connect. And I'm interested to know, I think from when we started to look at those sort of profound set of personal experiences, as you referred to it, how do you think that plays out in the space where you're designing with other people? So I can understand from a designer's perspective, or people that are given the challenge and are trying to work on it. But does that, if in the space of what Scott was talking about, this sort of designing with people, inviting others into the space, do you think it still applies? Because you're not trying to turn them into designers. These are people that are just part of the same journey that people are going through. Yeah.
At some level, I would love to turn everyone into a design thinker, right? And in part, engaging people in the process without equipping them with some of the capabilities to use the tools well, and to have a fundamentally different kind of conversation with each other. I think really without that, we just court disaster when we put a whole bunch of people in the room who all think differently and somehow magically expect they'll join hands and sing Kumbaya, and an amazing solution will result from their conversation. We know exactly the opposite generally occurs. Without preparation, people who think differently will debate and polarize, not come together around consensus, right? And so this question of how you structure the conversation, I think, becomes very clear and very important. Interestingly enough, if we think about it, how do things get done in all organizations? In fact, they get done when people talk to each other. Even all those years we lived on Zoom, the difference between a phone call and being able to look at each other and see each other and work through it, it is that human connection. And yet, if you look at how digital technology has advanced over the last 20 years or more, right? Think about it. Our phones now hold the capability of what it would have taken a 3-square block, 10-story building or something like that to have accomplished 30 years ago. And how much has our social technology advanced in parallel with that? I think a lot of us would argue that mostly social technology has gone the way of social media, and it has pushed us farther apart and made it more difficult for us to talk across difference than it did before. And so for me, in this polarized world, there's never been a time where the art of conversation and this ability to figure out how to listen across difference and form common definitions of the problem and specify what makes a solution good, and then understand you're probably going to get it wrong anyway, and you have to iterate and experiment to get it right. These are so easy to talk about, and they run counter to almost everything that we've been taught and that keeps organizations running. So I think we're looking at the need for profound changes, and yet these changes originate sometimes in things like turn-taking that we all learned in kindergarten. And so for me, that's the power of design thinking, the seeming simplicity on one hand, and yet the extraordinary complexity of the conversations it's helping us have.
Lovely. I like that. I love that framing of the simplicity within the complexity. Scott, just from the sort of pragmatic experiences that you've had in the designing sort of with space and the types of frameworks and tools that you've had to use, bearing in mind you bringing communities into a space that haven't been maybe exposed to the language or the tools and techniques, managing their expectations. Tell us a little bit about that in the projects that you've worked on.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I totally agree, Jeanne. I think there's definitely something fundamental about just how we show up in these conversations and provide a safe space to engage thoughtfully in what the challenge is, and understanding that in some cases, in organizations and governments and bureaucracies, there are competing agendas and priorities. So, you know, when I approach challenges like this, I don't necessarily lead with we're going to use design thinking necessarily. I think there's an opportunity to, you know, bring aspects of both design thinking, but also community organizing. I think it plays a valuable role and shows up very complementary in design, particularly looking at social impact challenges. I worked on a project, interestingly, and you were all sitting in a university right now. Jeanne, you work for a university, but I did a project with the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and they were, you know, in the wake of the George Floyd incident that happened, they were taking a long, hard look at themselves as a university to think about how they can more effectively dismantle racism. And not just within the university, but within Urbana-Champaign, which is a community in Illinois. And they, you know, the first conversation they had is, what is the role of the university in either contributing to this challenge or perpetuating it? And I think what they realized in having these conversations, that they need to build a coalition of stakeholders to engage more thoughtfully around what are the ways that they can come together and identify challenges that they are navigating unique to their community. And based on that, how can they action more effectively against it? Not with the university as the leader, but the university as a sort of facilitator. And what sort of strengths can the university bring and resources can they bring to these conversations, whether it's funding or research capabilities. And that was a really interesting reorientation for the university, for the community to come together and actually tangibly map out plans that brought community members into the conversation more effectively to address and then solve some of these challenges.
I'm going to open the questions to the floor, but before I do, I've got sort of one more question around the sort of this theme of design, thinking, and complexity. And a question to both of you is, personally, I don't feel we have the answers yet. I think the design thinking has emerged out of the design discipline, typically, as GK mentioned, sort of more around the service, the product, the experience space. But how do you think design thinking needs to evolve in order to start to deal with the complexity of the challenges that are emerging from the future? Is it about deconstructing, reconstructing? Is it about merging with other philosophies out there? Yeah, I'd like to get last thoughts from yourself and Scott on that. So, Jeanne, you first.
I guess my sense is we need to get better at a couple of key things that we don't do very well right now. One is this question of how we bring information into the conversation, how we visualize it, how these complex challenges, one of the biggest differences is just the amount of information it takes to talk intelligently about them. And although people, I think, have this misconception of design as being all about intuition and things, design is inherently data-driven. So we have that advantage, but this is extraordinarily complex data. And we are very early on in figuring out how to visualize complex data, right, in ways that make it accessible to the people who have to have the conversation. So I think there's an input question. How do we get much better at ramping up everybody in a conversation to share a common database in some ways in order to move forward? And then the other piece that happens is at the end. I think we talk about learning in action, we talk about experimentation, and no one really knows how to design an experiment. Right? I mean, yeah, maybe your product marketing people could talk about A/B tests and things like that, but to take the rest of us and to actually skill us in this question of how do we design and execute experiments so that we can move multiple ideas into a changing world and actually figure out which ones are working and which ones aren't and double down on the ones that are working and do the only thing that's harder than starting a new idea in most organizations, which is killing an idea that you thought was going to be great, but it's not. I just think that our tools are still quite rudimentary. And so design is extraordinary tools in certain areas, but we need some work on the tools to really handle the complexity of unpredictable environments that are very data rich.
Wonderful. Yeah, some work to be done there. And Scott, yes, interested to know your thoughts.
Yeah, Jeanne, that's such a great answer, and yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there's an opportunity. And I think there's the data piece, which is both quant and qual, right? How do we merge those insights more elegantly to shape a narrative that drives useful solutions and results? So I think there's that. And I think certainly because I've been so enmeshed and immersed in the social impact space, I think it's this acknowledgement that results won't happen right away. I think certainly in the fast-paced world and expectations around product design and certain aspects of design, I think there's this expectation that the solution will come within 12 weeks. It's typically how consulting projects are structured. So I think there's telling a better story around the timeline, the sort of practical timeline and continuum and journey that these stakeholders will not only need to go on near term, but continue to invest. And by invest, I mean time, money, conversation, throughout many cycles of design. And that design is not this fleeting process or experiment. It has to be sort of integrated into processes, behaviors over many years, really baked in, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott.
If I could just add, Richard, something that triggered in my mind with Scott's point is this notion we really have to rethink what data is, I think, in this world. And that's true both of those of us in kind of I would say the kind of hard statistical numbers people who don't actually count qualitative data as real data, right? I mean, who think if it's not a statistically significant sample size, it's nothing you should pay attention to. And when you think about the way in which we use data in design thinking at the front end, it's to inspire more creative thinking. It's not to prove anything. It's not to test anything. So we don't know in business what to do with data that's about inspiring. All data really is just part of a test as far as we're concerned. And yet, then we see artificial intelligence, right? And does artificial intelligence mean we don't need design thinking? No, because there's nothing scarier than artificial intelligence in the absence of actually a deep understanding of the context in which that data is gathered, right? And yet, artificial intelligence and those big data sets will tell you where to go deep with the more kind of resource-intensive design thinking methodologies. So I think even this notion of data itself, we really need to rethink and redefine and approach it as a much more complex thing than whatever the computer spits out in Excel spreadsheets, right, in our world.
Wonderful. Wonderful, thank you. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm going to open up to the floor and also online. Questions? One, two, and then we'll go to you, three. Yeah.
Hi, and thank you so much for opening up this conversation about complexity. I think we all need it so desperately in our nations and in our organizations. One of the things I've been thinking about in design thinking for the past few years, actually, and I haven't gotten very far, is how do we choose a user to design for in a complex situation where different stakeholders have different agendas, different needs for the same, seemingly same problem. Because in my experience, a lot of the power in design thinking is to be able to design for a user and minimize some of the complexity to have that one thing that you're designing for. But when it's a complex challenge, just in your experience, how does one get to that point of view for a particular user when you know that there's all this complexity and as you mentioned, the decentralization?
I don't think we very often have the luxury to just define for a single user anymore. To privilege one user to the extent that we can ignore the others. I mean, think about healthcare, right? If you're not designing for the caregiver as well as the patient, as well as the organization that's administering it, then you're not creating anything that actually is viable in the real world. Now, the challenge with that is the trade-offs are evident, right? And we are very bad at trade-offs. When faced with complex challenges that run counter to each other, we like to pick the first solution that comes up as a compromise, which rarely meets any design criteria, right? And rush that through because we're so uncomfortable with the conflict inherent in trying to manage a conversation to emergence, right? And for me, emergence is the kind of the magic word in all of this. How do you create the conditions for emergence so that you can design simultaneously for multiple groups that have conflict in terms they really want to accomplish, and at least try? Now, will you manage to come up with the one design that satisfies every group simultaneously? Absolutely not, and you will have to prioritize. But if you don't try to solve for the ideal possibility, you will surely never find it, right? And so I think this is the reality that we have.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Jeanne. And yeah, if okay, I'd love to build.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So as I mentioned, I'm working inside adjacent to federal government right now, and you're talking about a system that's designing for 333 million people, and to Jeanne's point, I think there's a meaningful conversation to be had about ensuring that a wide cross-section of voices are being brought into this conversation, because there's a saying in design that when you design for the extremes, you design for everyone. And when we talk about modernization in government and innovation in government, the default has been, let's develop a technology that's going to meet the needs of citizens, which is not the best orientation to bring to systems design challenges, because there are a lot of Americans who don't have access to laptops and iPhones, and so the conversation has to consider these outliers in this process, so that the solution becomes viable and feasible for a wider group and accessible to a wider group.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. Next question over here.
Hello. I'm a big fan of both. Very happy to be here to listen to you both. There was a pattern in both conversations, both Moore and Scott, about the fact that many of these interventions by design and design thinking have happened when there's some sort of crisis. When something broke, something terribly went wrong, and then people need to look at it. So I ask to both of you, is this something that is irrevocably connected to what we do, which is that we only call to the table when things kind of break or when there's some sort of big disruption. And maybe that's not even a bad thing because, like Jeanne said, that the solution comes from the emergence. Maybe the disruption is the emergence. But is this something that we need to just accept that things will break, will go wrong, and then that's when we were invited to come and look at it?
Well, I certainly think we have to get better at creating the perception of crisis because I think human nature is overwhelmingly to not dramatically change what you're doing today if you don't have to, right? So there's no group of people more motivated to change than people who have utterly failed at everything they've already tried. I mean, those are always their first port of call for design thinking in business. Find a group of people who've tried everything they can think of and there's nothing left, so they're resigned to the hard work of doing things differently and thinking differently. At the same time, that's a pretty pathetic view of the future, isn't it? Which, to me, the alternative is leaders have to get much better at inviting people into the conversation so that they see the need for change, at least before it blows up in our faces. And I think that's also, we haven't really gone down very much the leadership path, but I think most of the models of leadership we've got are just not up to the task of engaging a group of people and building an understanding of why we need change and how we might go about it together.
I love that. It's such a good point, Jeanne, and such an important question. And I think the big revelation for me, at least related to the work I was doing with the White House around customer experience, was that for so long, CX and design and government was this sort of fluffy, nice to have, right? And what we were able to do, at least conversationally, was make the legislative and quote unquote business case for CX, that CX is an imperative because it ultimately saves taxpayers money, right? And it costs government way more money to deliver a bad service that is poorly designed versus a good service that is well designed. And that reorientation was really powerful. And the second thing I will say around sort of design infrastructure and government was that the orientation now is less about this agency delivering this service, and it's more about what are the key life experiences that we all have as American citizens, and based on those experiences, how can we come together as federal agencies to collaborate around delivering a better experience for those citizens. So an example of that was we just looked at a citizen who experienced and survived a disaster, a hurricane, let's say, for example. And the insight early on was, oh, you're not just dealing with FEMA, which is the Emergency Management Administration. You're dealing with the Small Business Administration. You're dealing with the Housing and Development Agency. You are dealing with, HHS. So that was a great moment for this mechanism to be built so that these leaders can come together and talk about how their agencies all factor into the outcomes for American citizens. And that is really encouraging because it's not just triggered by crisis. There's actual, forethought, which is really encouraging. And I'm very optimistic about it all.
I love Scott's point about not solving problems for people that they don't think they have. Right? So often we get caught up and we decide something's a problem, and so we want to use tools to solve it. And yet, if you haven't taken that first step of convincing someone they have a problem, they really have no interest in all that activity that you're doing to solve it for them. So, that's something I think that's important to keep in mind.
And it's often only when the crisis happens do you realize you have the problem.
Yes.
So, yeah. We had another question over here.
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion. It's really interesting. So my background is different. I'm a sociologist and I've spent many years in higher education, and I'm just coming into design thinking just the last kind of month or so. Well, obviously I've been doing curriculum design for most of my life. And I just want to ask you something about, before we move to kind of designing for change, how do we do the learning part and the engagement part? And I'll just give you an example. So I teach a big course in the engineering faculty, and I'm a sociologist. And the course is called Social Infrastructures. And what we do is we actually teach the students to learn and engage, not to design for change. We need to give them a chance to kind of really understand and develop those lenses so that when they do become engineers, they can become more of a kind of citizen professional rather than a kind of a skilled professional. And this notion of social infrastructures is really helpful for us because it helps students understand what infrastructure we take for granted is the physical, but suddenly understanding the assets and the resources that maybe community organizations have, and we give them opportunity to engage with them. So I think as a sociologist, I'm really interested in the kind of stuff before we actually get to the design phase. And I just wanted to ask what you think about the learning and the engagement, particularly in the preparation of students as professionals. So it's almost take a step back from design thinking in my mind, and how do we prepare them to do the design thinking maybe in a slightly deeper and more kind of critical, citizen-oriented way? That's my question.
Thank you.
I guess I'd be loath to call it design thinking if it didn't begin with immersion in the lived experience and a deep understanding of the context of those you're trying to design for. I'm trying to imagine a definition of design thinking that starts after what you've just described. And I'm sure there's a lot of decision making that starts there, but in my mind, it doesn't deserve to be called design thinking. And I think that it runs into our whole expertise problem as well, right? Telling people what the lived experience of someone else is without them having interacted and had a chance to make an emotional connection with that doesn't really shift anyone or make them more prepared or more intelligent about how to design for them. So I think with students, we know forcing them into the field early on is critical, and they hate it. You know, I always joke that my students all believe they could run a major global corporation the day after graduation and be just fine. And when I tell them they have to go to a supermarket and actually talk to a shopper, they panic. Like, I didn't sign up for that. You know, it's because, you know, it's the teenagers sitting around in a table all on their phones, not talking to each other, right? We want everything mediated for us by technology or by a big database or those kinds of things. And so I think if we're not forcing students out into the real world to interact with the people that we expect them to design for, then it is highly unlikely that we could possibly be doing our job, right?
Yeah, I think too, and it's interesting. You're all sitting at a D school right now,
Yeah.
right? And the D school is it's a model, right? It's a model that brings these disparate disciplines and students together to solve challenges, and that in itself, even though some of them won't go on to become expert practitioners of design, that in itself invites and gives permission to these interdisciplinary folks to collaborate creatively around a problem. And that is pretty mind-blowing if you're not exposed to it, right? And this is a forcing function to expose folks to that. So the advice I would give you is to try to figure out ways to work with your university leadership to model some of what D School's doing. Maybe it's a design thinking workshop that shepherds these disparate communities through this process so that they're, you know, working on a hypothetical design challenge together. And I think that will stimulate more conversations about making investments in design as a scalable practice across the university.
Like to follow up.
Not to respond to that directly, but just to say, interestingly, Jeanne, just in your response, the students clamor to do this course. It's the course that they've wanted to do their whole life. And many of them say, that's why I wanted to do engineering. So, you know, getting them into that world, it very much depends on how we frame that engagement with the world. So that's what I think I'm really interested in, is how do we, not necessarily through design thinking, but how do we intentionally frame the lenses that we want students to use as designers going forward? And there's a dimension of engaging that broader social context. So how do we enable students to engage that broader social context in ways that gets them to work for kind of justice and gets them to work for inequality, particularly in a context like this? And I think that's often the missing piece. We kind of push them into the design piece quite quick. Well, that's my critique of it, instead of spending time immersing them in the kind of social and in their own socials, because they all come with that social.
Yeah. And creating the psychological safety. I mean, we've talked about psychological safety a bit here already today. These are extremely uncomfortable kinds of activities for most people to do. In particular, we tell people to deal with conflict. Most people are conflict averse. And the more, when we start to talk about social justice, these are really hard conversations to have. And so you need, I believe, a lot of structure to create enough psychological safety for anyone to feel like they can take the risk of actually bringing their authentic self into the conversation. Because without that, we can sit around and talk all we want, but if people are withholding what they really think and what they really believe because they're afraid of what will happen if they say it, then we're also not really going to accomplish much.
Absolutely. Mindful of time, do we have any online questions? No? Any more questions at the back there? Yeah.
Hi, my name's Marsha. Thanks for a very fascinating afternoon session. I think, even though I had a lot of coffee, I didn't need it with this exciting talk. So my question is around, we've spoken a lot, and you've spoken a lot about the user experience and immersion, and it sounds like a lot of emphasis is at the beginning of the process. So I would like to hear your perspectives on how you carry that immersion, that user experience, kind of that lived experience throughout the process, particularly as it gets to the phases of experimenting and when you need to make those decisions of what to continue with, scale, adopt, mainstream, and those you need to, as you say, the difficult part actually end. So I would just like to hear about that, how you actually carry through that engagement and that immersion with your clients, your citizens, if it's government, throughout the design thinking process. Thanks.
Thank you. You want to go first?
Well, certainly it seems to me in a world where you've got limited resources and you have to prioritize, that if you haven't gotten the design criteria part right, nothing else works very well. So the whole point of the front end of design, to me, is to reach alignment on who we're designing for, even if it's a complex series of users, and what are the qualities of a great solution, right? If we build consensus and alignment around that before we go into idea generation and testing, then those criteria guide us through a complex world where people keep changing their minds and data shifts around us. They guide us through ideation, and then, most important perhaps, they guide us through an experimentation process that helps us figure out which ideas to give up on and which ones to move to the next stage. If you don't get the design criteria part right, the rest of it just doesn't work, right? Because you haven't built alignment around decision points. And so I think that's why the front end of design thinking is so critical. You still need the back end, and I don't think we pay enough attention to how to do it well. But without the front end, you could do all the experimentation you want, and everyone will still disagree at the end of those experiments about which ideas are really the ones worth moving forward.
Yeah, I love that, Jeanne. And I think from a process standpoint and a journey standpoint, I think sometimes designers, particularly on the public sector side, forget about the immense responsibility they have to the users they're designing for. So it's never been more important to bring users along with you on that journey so that you are learning together, because they are the experts in their lived experience. We are not experts, we're conduits, right? And are responsible for redistributing power, essentially, as designers in public sector. So the work that I get to do with design teams and government teams is insistent bringing those users along with us. And there's nothing more inspiring to a user than when they see their words and their input show up in the design, in the prototype, and in the build. And I think that is a really powerful force and reminder to design teams to create an accessible environment for your users so that their fingerprints are represented in the end product.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jeanne and Scott. So I've got a big red screen in front of me that says time's up. I'm sure there's probably some other questions, but we'll have time this evening, I think, when we have a little gathering to approach Jeanne and perhaps not so much Scott for asking the questions. But just to conclude, I think for me, we've moved a little bit into the interrogate space of this conference, where we're starting to push the limits of some of the thinking, the concepts around the importance of language, understanding the importance of emergence, the new tools that we need to maybe start to look at. Maybe reframing the concept of data and what data is actually useful for us, and specifically around big data. And then the role that leadership have to play in all of this. So super excited to see that there's still work to be done, I think is the exciting part. I don't think we have all the answers of the role that design plays in this sort of world of complexity that we face today. But that gives us a job to do, and I think that's really what the exciting part of a conference like this is it's still lots of work to be done. So I'd just like to really thank Jeanne and Scott. Thank you very much for your time and your input.
Thank you.
And I'll hand back to Africa.
Another round of applause, please, for Richard, Jeanne, and Scott. Thank you.
Oh,
I mean, you're most welcome to
I'm
sit
leaving.
for the
Okay,
next
We are dismissed.
20 minutes or so, but
calm and elegant gesture. I didn't realize you were actually saying, get the hell off the stage.
while we are applauding, I know it's only the end of day one, but my word, it's been a fascinating first day to this Con Festival. A round of applause, please, for everyone at D-School Africa. And certainly to all the speakers and the contributors to this incredible, incredible day. Now, I've got 20 minutes on the clock, which means it's 20 minutes where you give me feedback on what has risen to the surface for you, what is there to celebrate around design thinking, what is there to interrogate, and Richard almost alluded to some of that in the last session, and of course, what we should be anticipating. What we'll do is give Grant a chance to finish that incredible farming of ideas and reflections. He's going to be coloring in stuff and doing all sorts of stuff. And then I think at the start of tomorrow morning, we'll take about 5 minutes, Grant, and you can just reflect what it is that came through for you. We also had breakaway sessions, which obviously we could not be at everything all at once. And I'm happy for feedback from that. But just a show of hands, what's emerging for you today? How are you feeling? What is day one meaning for you, and what are you taking away? And of course, if you're online, you can use the Q&A tab on the app in order for you to share your reflections as well, and we'll take those to air. Any burning hands? We can start right here.
Hi everyone, my name is Nsako Ngiba. I think what's emerging for me is this whole notion of social technology. As a technologist, you start to build this, I guess, this notion that technology is the solution to all problems. And I guess what is really sitting with me today is that perhaps, you shouldn't start off with that assumption, with the view of I'm going to validate whether this works or not, but rather being more open-minded from the onset that perhaps the solutions could come from completely different domains and have nothing to do with technology, and that's perfectly fine, which is quite difficult to grapple with as an engineer. But I think it's also something really important as well because, just the exclusionary nature as well of technology at times is one aspect that I think as engineers you often forget in the design process.
Especially in an African context,
Yeah.
right? Where depending on whether you live in Ronnebosch in Cape Town or in Ronnebosch East, in fact, which is less than 5 kilometers away, or Athlone or Hanover Park or Guguletu, those different communities access technology differently.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for that. We'll go to the lady in green and white and then to the gentleman. Lady in green and white, only because she put up her hand before you. That's all.
Hi. I think the one thing that emerged for me today, and it's actually something that I've been wondering about for a while, a lot of the conversations was about inviting stakeholders to participate in conversations and users. But the reality of the day and time we live in is two things that are in short supply for everyone. Is time and trust. Those are two things that are essential to invite stakeholders into conversations. So for me, one of the key questions is, how do you get people to participate in conversations when time and trust for everyone is in short supply?
Let me push a little bit. Are you talking, if you can just give it back, thank you. We managed 320 people who registered to be on site, and another 80 who have decided to take part of their day, if not the full day, for the next 3 days to be part of this conversation. Granted, a lot of them are, we're preaching to the choir. Some of them have a general interest and an inquiring mind and want to see what's coming out. What context are you speaking at, where you're presented with a challenge, you then have to invite people in a room, that kind of setup?
Thinking of social challenges or organizational challenges, for example, when you working within an organization where most people say they've bought into the idea of design thinking, but you still operate to some extent in silos. Time and resources are in short supply, so even though people agree that you need to talk and get the whole design thinking process going, time is in short supply for everyone. So it's hard to find time where everyone is prepared to invest enough time to do that. And also sometimes those silos they don't say it, but they don't necessarily trust each other.
Yeah.
So for me that becomes an interesting question in this whole conversation.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you. The gentleman.
Yeah, thank you. For me, what I'm both celebrating and anticipating is this sense of obviously personally, but I get the feeling around the room as well, this readiness and appetite for something new to emerge, kind of an evolution into something that isn't quite clear. And this feels like there's a theme of that the discovery comes from the questions and not from the answers. And I feel quite excited to be on my board and waiting for the next wave to emerge. And I might fall off, but I'm ready to get wet anyway.
If you don't mind passing on the microphone then to the lady. And then we'll come to the online reflections.
Cool. Thank you so much for a fun and informative day. I feel like I have more questions now than I did at the start of the day.
Good. That was the objective.
My reflection is we keep having conversations about who are we designing for and who is doing the designing. And this whole conference has just made me think, we are D-School Africa. We need to find ways to make design thinking embedded in our local communities. Who's not in the room? Those are the people we're actually designing for, and it's not fair for us to go and impose a design solution on them. So I'm just trying to think of ways that we can share the knowledge. Yeah.
and I suppose the shifting of the needle is that phrasing designing for and shifted to designing with.
Yes, exactly.
Because they need to be in the room. They need to be, from as early as possible, part of the journey.
Yes.
To realizing a solution.
And also, how do we get those people into this room? Like, are they represented at this conference? Just a question. You don't have to answer it.
Now, the typical thing I would do as a talk show host is turn to Richard and say, Richard, However, I am hosting and emceeing, and he's paying my check, so I'm not going to be sending. I'm not going to be sending that question through today. Okay.
What resonated, what Jeanne said is design thinking is a movement towards goodness. And yeah, it's a celebration worthwhile because that's a big thing towards goodness. And that's what I feel now, the climate, the way we talk and discuss ideas with each other from different backgrounds, that's what vibrates this goodness among us, or towards others.
I enjoyed about the panel I moderated when Lillian, who was in Sao Paulo in Brazil, was saying business in Latin America, or at least the entity she works for, works deliberately with suppliers who are socially progressive. And it's almost something we need to be deliberate about, right? We need to be, it's one of it's not a tick box, but one of the considerations we have to put into the equation in coming up with solutions, in participating in a process of this nature. So thank you very much for that. We'll take a couple of online, and then after the online, we'll come to you.
Yeah, so while I have the mic, just an online comment. Also just saying that my half has more comments than Rob's half. So from online, emerging is optimism and a sense of possibility, celebrating the growing community, interrogating how can design thinking navigate leadership in areas of high power and hierarchy, and anticipating the global impact by design thinking.
Nice. Thank you very much.
Gosh, now I need to go after that. I think my comment is it's a curiosity, but so just because everyone's in the room doesn't mean that they feel they have a voice. And often that voice is not authentic then, because they either say what they think you want to hear, or they say what another person in the group's saying. So how do you know that it's authentic voice? And how do you, I suppose, how do you make sure that you have the right people in the room that will speak up? And I suppose that's a curiosity, and it's a little bit about voice and a little bit about agency, I suppose.
Because then the challenge is in designing whatever the gathering or the meeting, who is the person who determines who's going to be in that room? And therefore, to your question of who is in the room, and once you get those people into the room, it then falls on the moderator, the facilitator, to make sure that you create a safe enough environment for people to express honestly so that their true voice can be heard. I'm just reflecting. I'm not providing solutions. Not providing solutions. A microphone disappeared somewhere.
Yeah. Hi. I think my reflections today are similar to the comments that have been made. I think, beyond are the communities in the room and do they have a voice, but also who will implement in terms of sustainability. And also in terms of sustainability, I think of scale, right? So the Design School Africa is now here at UCT, but how do we scale it to other parts of Africa? Must we scale it through university partnerships? I think earlier we talked about a global alliance. Is that all university partnerships? Do we go to the communities? Do we create impact hubs, youth centers? What do we do to create scale at the community levels?
I actually am going to bring Richard into that, because he and I had a 45-minute conversation about this very point, and I don't know if you can truncate that to 2 minutes, just to talk about how D-School Africa, while it's physically located in this beautiful campus of the University of Cape Town, actually purports to get as much of Africa as possible in the conversation. Can we have Richard's microphone on, please?
I think the vision, and also from the Hatsa-Plattner Foundation, is that one doesn't want to build physical D-schools like this at only certain locations. This is a catalyst to start the conversation. And in some ways, we need to be teaching more out of this building than inside the building. But at least there's a base here that we can convene like this. And hopefully next year or in 5 years, we'll convene somewhere else. But certainly, we need to be teaching this out there at the schools, in the communities, and not expecting people to come to this space. the whole time. And part of this conference, in fact, tomorrow we're convening with a group of African universities to start that conversation of how we can start to build a network, a practice across Africa, looking at the different contexts from a teaching, learning, and research perspective. So certainly for us, this is a home that people can come to and have conversations, but absolutely the impact needs to be way beyond just these 3 walls in this triangular-shaped building.
It is good to have a school of this nature located in a university because, one, you can then, I suppose, use the currency of that university name. This is very much an entity that almost operates independently of the university. So, for example, it doesn't matter which university you come from, certainly in South Africa, or the rest of the African continent, you have an opportunity to engage and enjoy some of the programs that are here. I know there's work being done in West Africa, as well as East Africa, as well as North Africa, that will ultimately connect all of these conversations. And as you will see with the tours tomorrow, you'll then be going out to the areas that are impacted by some of the design thinking that happens in this building. So one of the speakers earlier said that the school is not the building, but all of us in the room here individually. Thank you very much for that. Microphone, please.
Hi, that's okay. Yeah. So I wanted to touch on something that I picked up in one of the main, in one of the panel speakers, that Mana talked about cultural humility. And in the parallel session with youth and mental health well-being, the same thing was echoed about how we're going to spaces and having that cultural humility when we go into those spaces. And I thought it was very important because we will always, I think in Africa in general, we'll always be going into culturally sensitive areas no matter where we are. Even if we just move around our own spaces in Cape Town, it's so different if you just move like 20 kilometers down the way here. And I think that cultural humility, I think it can also just be humility in general, like always having that humility that you don't know everything. Yeah. And I think that's what we kind of need, that's what I found is very interesting, and we kind of need to hold on to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Hi, today got my brain all up in it is. This was fabulous. I think that the quote, and I think Scott mentioned it, that will resonate with me is we are responsible for redistributing power. And if we, to tie into the getting the right people in the room, if you don't include in your design team the people in the group that you are empathizing toward in the actual design process, then I kind of think that that's the biggest gap that you can possibly have. So yes, researching a particular segment of society, that's fair, but there have to be, it must be an us thing going through the design process to make it sort of impactful on a deeper level. So that was, I think that, and the fact that trust is so important, and if you can't within that space, in the design team kind of space, if you can't create trust, then you're also not going to get sort of an authentic way of thinking. Yeah, so that's sort of my thought about that.
Thank you. Jenny, I'm not sure if we have space in the next 2 days, but that conversation around trust, I think is a pivotal one. And I'm not sure how we're going to do it. Is it a different conference altogether? I'm not sure. But that's important. So it's all well and good getting the right people into the room, but how do they trust that the process actually is going to have the outcome that they desire, or that is going to be rewarding or satisfying? How do they trust that their voice is going to be heard, that they're not going to be judged, that they're not going to be ridiculed or discarded? You know, all those issues around trust, I think, because that has come up quite strongly in the reflections today. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I have one thing to celebrate and another one to interrogate. I think we are all celebrating the value of human-centeredness of design thinking and the fact how innovations are
being designed in a more human-centered way. And it's also great to see in how many different contexts the approach unfolds and is being applied. However, we are living on a planet with limited resources that we're sharing also with other living beings. So I would like to interrogate, or maybe even to anticipate, how do we make sure with all the human-centeredness that we design for a sustainable future, having in mind that the limitedness of our resources on this planet, and respecting other living beings as well.
I couldn't agree more. It shouldn't be the fact that you have your own child or a nephew or niece that you have to worry about. It should be top of mind, regardless of what your family dynamic is, that we need to leave this earth in pristine condition for future generations. And the rate at which we are going right now, it's scary. And a lot of the solutions will lie in this room. Thank you for your reflections. Oh, okay, one more.
It's really okay.
Sorry, just to say, my name might be Africa, but the concept of African time doesn't exist in this being. So I will get you out of here at 5, and I'll get you to your social. That I promise.
I'll be really quick. I guess my takeaway from today really is, you know the saying where a coal maintains its glow if it stays close to the fire. And I guess for me it's gratitude to be part of this fire. Just because we energize ourselves being part of this network. We learn from each other. Being in an organization trying to implement design thinking is tough. And I guess sharing in our experiences, our lessons, our tips, it's been so invigorating and re-energizing. So gratitude is what I walk away with today. So thank you.